Good afternoon, everybody. I know it's April Fool's, but we take ourselves very seriously here. April Fool's. For our history segment today, we will head to 1930s Manitowish Waters and learn about one of the most harrowing fires in Wisconsin history. We'll get to all of that in a bit, but first, here's your top four at 4. Welcome back to Up North at 4. I'm now joined by Jim Bokern from the Manitowish Waters Historical Society. Jim, how are you doing?
Doing well, Dan. Thank you.
It is fire season right now. There's been a lot of wildfires going on around the state. And today we're going to talk about a very, very big fire from many years ago, the Powell Marsh Fire. So let's hear about that.
Yes. Sadly, many communities like Manitowish Waters have forest fire stories spanning over a century. And as we enter into fire season, it should keep us mindful to be careful, to be thankful for our first responders, and also for timely rains like we've enjoyed the last few days. But when drought comes, problems follow. And the Powell Marsh Fire actually burned for 2 years, 1933 through 1934, and that's because it was a peat fire, and we'll talk about how the peat can burn in these swamps. But when you think about the 1930s, in 1933 to 1934, you think of drought. And most people think dust storms, which was really the case in the southwestern part of the state and throughout the breadbasket of America. But when you think about drought in the Northwoods, you should think about fire. We got a really good image of forest fires near Manitowish in 1933, and you just see the smoke billowing up in front of a farmstead, threatening basically all the communities up to the UP. So we're going to follow this Powell Marsh Fire, and it's over a year-long challenge to the Northwoods. Well, every fire has to have a story for how it started, and we're getting most of our information from a colorful member of our community, Carl Christensen. And we'll be talking about Carl a lot, but he said they were going to heat up a cup of coffee or something with a little campfire, and they started this fire. And like I said, it burned over a year. We have an image of Carl Christensen on the right, and it's a famous image that you'll find out about when you talk to Kay Kranz in a few weeks. But Carl was also an expert in the use of dynamite, and this will prove very helpful in battling the fire on Powell Marsh. I have a map that's included that is from about 1917, and it shows a yellow line marking where the fire line was, and a green, red, and blue arrow that will follow throughout the presentation that'll show you where Carl Christensen took a stand against this fire in 1933. We're going to start with the green arrow, and the Civilian Conservation Corps at Camp Mercer was right in the area, and Carl talks about the tank sprayers that the CCC boys wore on their back, and he was very critical in helping them fill those tanks and battle this fire. If you look at the DNR slide that was shared with us, you see a ranger unloading a bunch of CCC men, and there's a yellow arrow pointing at a tank, and that's one of those squirt tanks. He has the squirting nozzle on the top of the tank. The tank is down below his waist, and he's hauling that heavy tank out into the fire itself. They were also using other tools like axes and shovels. They even have a bulldozer. So they have a lot of equipment to battle this because it was pretty nasty. But what Carl said is once they got out on the Powell Marsh with those squirt tanks, we're in a drought, and the water isn't there. So he had the CCC boys dig a hole 6 feet down. He packed it with dynamite because he was trained in dynamite demolition. He detonates it and makes this giant crater. So that's exciting in its own right. But beyond that, just think about these boys. Now they're not only fighting a fire, running across marsh and marsh grass, they got to jump down into this hole, which is all basically peat and mud. And they got to fill their tanks, run up the hole, and then go back in the fire. And this is their day, their weeks going forward. So it gives you some appreciation of the intensity of the fighting. And then, you know, using those tractors and shovels and other tools, the CCC boys and others held this fire line at that first arrow. If you take a look at the big orange arrow on one of the maps I have, it shows where the fire largely was. All the yellow arrows from Lac du Flambeau to Mercer, Winchester, Presque Isle joined in Manitowish Waters, and the red box along the Manitowish River, that's where Camp Mercer is and these CCC boys. They marshaled a total of 600 to 700 men to battle this fire for weeks on end as it threatened the communities. As we move to the next battle point, we're going to be looking at the red arrow along the canal. There's an interesting canal that was built by the Southgate Estate, and actually that great property will burn in this fire and be largely destroyed. But you can see a picture of the canal, and the yellow arrows show where the canal is. So Christensen was charged with taking care of that canal. A local leader, George Laporte, said we need to get water in that canal so they could use their lift pumps and try to hold a fire line. Well, what happens next is a series of calamities, because as they were keeping the canal cleared, they weren't observing the area around them, and Carl Christensen and a helper from up in Presque Isle were surrounded by fire, cut off from the rest, and trapped. The fire created its own wind at that point, and he stood behind pine trees that acted like rocks in a river and created an eddy for them to breathe. But I mean, this is not a long-term strategy to survive a forest fire. You're going to die. So they literally run to the closest lake. They dig a hole down on the edge of the lake, and they go full muskrat and go under the bank, wetting their handkerchiefs, and the fire rolls right over them, and they survive. When they come up, the fire is burning in front of them, and their family members, Christensen's wife, they all thought that they were dead. But they actually survived, came back, regrouped, and of course they went on to fight the fire again. And now we're at the blue arrow over by Swamp Lake, or like Walton Lake. Here, fighting side by side with Lac du Flambeau firefighters, they were trying to stop again the fire from moving into the communities of Boulder Junction and Manitowish Waters and Lac du Flambeau as well. This was such a fierce fire and was really quite notorious for a long time. And as you can see in the newspaper articles, you know, they document 600 to 700 men were battling that Powell Marsh Fire in 1933. And the fire was so devastating, and many couldn't really handle the pressure. It's like post-traumatic stress. And we see from a news article that 8 of the CCC enrollees refused to fight the fire because of the danger and the peril. And instead, they spent 30 days in the jail in Iron County. And it kind of gives you an understanding of what our first responders face when they try to protect us in our communities. It is really a challenging, heroic effort. So some really do argue that this peat fire, as it says in the article that I have highlighted for 1934, drove the fire feet down into the peat moss and stayed there all winter, burned and smoldered, and come spring, it resurrected again. Now, this is going to be a smaller fire, but the CCC boys will actually fight this one again and dug miles of trenches and ditches in Powell Marsh to try to mitigate that. We have pictures of the fire billowing up over the Manitowish Waters, over the Manitowish River at Camp Mercer. And they fought that for, again, weeks and weeks and weeks. And again, in the Mercer Monitor newspaper, they still reference that those peat fires were the absolute worst. This smaller fire in 1934, Camp Mercer alone put 36,000 man-hours in suppressing this fire. So again, showing you the scale and effort to protect the properties of the Northwoods. And that fire season in spring, we have some nice pictures of them holding an active fire line with burning trees. And those are actually Camp Mercer enrollees on the Powell Marsh Fire and the burnover after effect. Importantly, the CCC boys will start to build fire towers, fire lanes, and telephone communications, and start to create a more centralized network that could reach out throughout the Northwoods and suppress fires and protect our communities. So that's the Powell Marsh Fire.
Jim, you really transported me to like a war. Like I felt like this is a war with multiple battles. I've never kind of heard of firefighting from that perspective. So thanks so much for joining us to talk about the Powell Marsh Fire.
You bet.
Thanks to Dan Hagen for putting together that wonderful report on the Powell Marsh Fire. As an addendum from the Manitowish Waters Historical Society, Carl Christensen was unavailable for the 1934 fire season with those detailed stories we enjoyed in 1933. In the first week as constable of Manitowish Waters, or then Spider Lake, Christensen was shot 8 times by Babyface Nelson as FBI and local authorities tried to capture the Dillinger gang. Indeed, Christensen had 2 close scrapes with death within a year and was a long-lived and colorful character of Manitowish Waters.